So we are diving into chapter 36 today, and it's one of those chapters that isn't necessarily fun. You know, genealogies aren't always fun to trace and listen to. You know, as somebody's son of so-and-so is son, and so, right? It gets a little bit long, but there's a few things that I think are important to point out. First and foremost, we see right away it says, now this is the history of the descendants of Esau, that is Edom. Edom comes from the word in, I think it's Genesis 25:30, when Esau sold his birthright to Jacob for a pot of soup, and that soup was red. And so he says, give me that red soup because I am red, or Edom. And so that is where this term Edom comes from the red. He was very red in skin color. When we see when he was born, it talks about it, that he was hairy and red, right? This is what he's known for. He's hairy and red. And so we see that an entire generation then is called Edomites. They're not called Esauites, they're called Edomites, which is a very interesting thing because they are referred to the very sin that Esau created. Now that's interesting. So they didn't call themselves Esauites, they called themselves Edomites, and Edom represents him betraying that birthright for a bowl of soup. And so I think it's crazy to think to me of an entire nation being named after a sinful moment. Now, that is not a great heritage that you want, right? That's not the way to start out a lineage. And so we see they go on, and there's lots of different lineage. One of the things I want to point out is that we only see names in here. We don't see any history. We don't see any stories about any of these people, because only the lineages and only the stories of those that serve God are the ones that are included in most of the Bible. We see some lineages here and there, and I see that this is an attachment of Esau is mentioned here, and Esau's family is mentioned almost as a posterity to Isaac, not to Esau. He's saying this is one of Isaac's sons, so we better kind of show it. And so they only go to like the third or fourth generation in this chapter talking about the lineage, and then they disappear from the Bible. We don't hear about them. I mean, we hear about some of his sons that became other nations, like Amalek is one of his sons, so we hear about the Amalekites later, which is interesting because almost all of the ones that we then hear reference of his children were all enemies of Israel. Not great, right? So this is the lineage of the enemies of Israel, basically. And so we see in here that Esau says, okay, we're too prosperous. Now, isn't it interesting that Esau was still prospered because of his attachment to Isaac? Like I said earlier, God promised he would take care of Isaac's family, and he's keeping that promise. But God keeps his promises when we obey, right? Esau stops obeying, and so it's as if that blessing starts to pull away through the generations, and we see that. But we see that Esau went on, and he moved to a place around Mount Seir, which is now kind of, if you've ever seen the cool pictures of that place called Petra, that's that city in the rock, or that really famous building that's built into the rock. This is where he was at. Now, was he the families and was his the generation that created that? We don't think so. We think that Petra came later, but he was right there. He was in a very fortified city, fortified area. And we see over and over again in this lineage, they use the terms chiefs and kings to describe his different places. And so we see that his children had a name. But then we see that Jacob's family doesn't have names. They're shepherds. And so what I think is interesting is titles and names are not important to God. What is important to God is those that follow after him. And so we see that they became kings and priests. So they said are kings and chiefs. And so they were a very militaristic family, which then also proves earlier when Isaac said, you will live by the sword. He spoke that to Esau in his blessing. He said, you will live by the sword. And so we see that they're a very militaristic family, a militaristic descent. And so they have kings in these different places. So we see that Esau set up kingdoms long before Israel ever became a place that had kings. And so when the Bible says that Israel was wanting to have a king like all the rest of the nations, this is one of the nations. And it's a little bit, to me, interesting that it's a little bit of that jealousy passed down through generations of like, well, really, that's our uncle and he's kings. Why are we not kings? And so we see that there's these different things developing. And it's interesting to note some of these names. We have Amalek is one of his sons, which we know is the Amalekites later, who are an enemy of Israel. And so we see that this warring began with two brothers, and that it carried down to the generations, just like what was prophesied and what was blessed or what was spoken about the two of them. And so there's not a lot more out of this chapter that I pulled out, but I do want to point those things out. And I think that it's important to remember that only the things we do for God and for his kingdom and for his sake are the only things that matter. Otherwise, we just are a drying up lineage that nobody cares about. So remember that as you make your choices today and how you live your life. Join us next week for chapter 37.